to secure their freedom or to purchase their freedom. And the idea comes from the Old Testament, specifically the law of Moses, like Exodus. You're looking at Exodus like chapter 21. And it talks about how a slave, a person who was a slave could have their freedom purchased. And there were kind of two reasons why you would purchase somebody's freedom. You could be in slavery for a few different reasons. One was like if you were a captured person, you could end up in slavery. If you were born into slavery, sometimes you would end up that way. But then there were also a lot of people who sold themselves into slavery.
Hey, welcome to White Fields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us again this week. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady. He's the pastor of White Fields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado. And we are back, and I can actually say that this time. We are back in our series, Behold the King. Yep. Back in the Gospel of Matthew. And we did take a short break. Actually, we took quite a long break, a little bit for Advent. And then and we looked at the 7 letters, the 7 churches in Revelation. Excellent. If you haven't seen any of that, definitely want to look at that as well. But we are back in chapter 20 of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 17 through 34. And the title of the message was Developing Godly Ambition. So missed any of that, you can go over to whitefieldschurch.com and you can download or stream the message there on our website. And of course, on the app as well, WFCC, if you want to find it on the Google Play or on the App Store. And a great benefit of having the app is you get notified every time we go live. You have access to all the files are just there on the app, all of our podcast files, any sermon, anything. And then anytime there's things happening here, you get notified. So great thing to have, great resource for you. And of course, Facebook, YouTube, you're watching us, like and subscribe, interact, say you like it, say you don't like it, ask a question, leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. And if you rate and review on your favorite podcast app, that certainly helps us. And the way it helps us is this way anytime you interact with us anyway on any of these platforms, it just helps these things come up to the surface and we get more notoriety, if I can use that word, when people are asking questions about what does ambition mean? Can a Christian have ambition? Is there such a thing? Is ambition bad? Hey, it's going to pop up. We're going to show up in their search window, and we'll be able to provide Christ-centered, gospel-centered answers to their questions. And so today we're going to kind of dive into something that you didn't really have time really to talk about on Sunday morning. Chapter 20, verse 28, it says, "Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So we want to kind of look at what is that word. What are we talking about here when we're talking about Jesus, the Son of Man, coming to give his life as a ransom for many? We're just going to chat about that a bit today.
So this metaphor of being a ransom, ransom is, you could think if someone is being held captive, a ransom is a price that somebody else pays for them to secure their freedom or to purchase their freedom. And the idea comes from the Old Testament, specifically the law of Moses, like Exodus. You're looking at Exodus like chapter 21. And it talks about how a slave, a person who was a slave could have their freedom purchased. And there were kind of two reasons why you would purchase somebody's freedom. You could be in slavery for a few different reasons. One was like if you were a captured person, you could end up in slavery. If you were born into slavery, sometimes you would end up that way. But then there were also a lot of people who sold themselves into slavery. And that was a way of like getting economic help and security. So for example, kind of like not that different than today. Like let's say you're broke and you need money. You would essentially like sell yourself to someone, almost like an employee, but you're bound until you work off the debt. So let's say, you need to pay off this big debt. So you would work for this person and you'd work off your debt. And once you were done paying off that debt through your work, then you would be free. Or someone else could come along and pay that debt for you, and then you would be free right away. It's kind of like, you think like, I've never actually seen this happen, but I heard it does, maybe in movies or something, that like, let's say you're at a restaurant and you forgot your wallet. So they make you like go back and wash the dishes for like 2 hours to pay off your meal. It's that kind of idea. Right. But people would do this in the past. They still do it in places in the world today. And we kind of still do that. If you think about like how a loan works or how a job works, right? Like that's kind of how it works. Yeah.
Yeah. So when we're talking about ransom, I guess there has been historically debate over who this ransom is paid for. So Jesus came to give his life as a ransom. Who are the actors in this question? So, are we talking about us? Who's the ransom paid to? Let's define that a little bit.
Yeah, okay, so definitely it's for us, right? We're the ones who are captive. Yeah. And what are we captive to? Well, we're captive to sin. That's like Jesus said that in John chapter 8. Anyone who sins is a slave to sin. He said, but the Son came to set you free. Okay, then we've got like Romans chapter 6. Anybody who sins is a slave to sin. So in other words, you're not free, you're a slave to sin. And, even this takes us back to some Old Testament pictures. Like we see the children of Israel in bondage and slavery in Egypt. And then God comes along and he sends a message through Moses to Pharaoh. And the message is, let my people go so that they may serve me. In other words, it's not just go and do whatever they want, to go and serve me. So it's a change of ownership, if you will. No longer will they be slaves and servants of Pharaoh, but now they will be servants and bondservants of the Lord. So you can see this like Paul the Apostle. He identifies himself as a bondservant of Jesus Christ. And a bondservant is literally someone who, their freedom was purchased, but they chose to remain in that servanthood relationship because their master was so good to them. Again, that picture comes directly from Exodus 21 and the law of Moses, where, a person, even if their freedom was purchased, they could choose to continue working for that same master if they were a good master. So, okay, what does that mean? Well, Jesus is the one who pays the ransom by his blood. We are the one who are captive. We're captive to sin. You could also say there's another picture in here where we have a debt. So whenever we sin, we accrue or accumulate a debt before God. So like Psalm 51, I believe, David says, against you and you alone, Lord, have I sinned, right? And so I have a debt before God that I cannot pay. And so, we are slaves to sin. We have a debt before God. And so the question is, I guess, so we know those two parts, right?
Yeah. So who is this? Who's it being paid to, this ransom? Exactly. That's the question.
Yeah, okay, so historically, there are three views. Put it this way, there's two views and a third. Yeah. Okay, the two views. The first view was articulated famously by Origen, who's a church father, but he's kind of like a questionable church father, right? Like he had like a lot of views that we now look back on and we're like, well, that was probably not right. Yeah. But he was an active, person in the theological debates going on in the 3rd century. So this is 200s AD. Yeah. So very early on, right? But there's several of Origen's views that are now looked at as being like probably not correct. Okay, so Origen said, he looked at this verse, asked the question, who's the ransom being paid to? And his answer was, it was being paid to the devil. In other words, Jesus paid the devil some money with his blood and with his life in order to set us free. And the idea is therefore that Satan has rights over us. We've handed ourselves over to Satan. There are a few verses that could be read in this way. A good example of this would be Ephesians chapter 2, right? That we were walking, because you were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you formerly walked, according to the way of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, who is Satan, right? So, and Jesus referred to Satan as the ruler of this world. In 1 John, it says, he's talked about the ruler of this world, the God of this age. So the idea is that the whole world, that's the verse I was thinking about. The whole world is under the control of the evil one, right? So does that mean that we were held captive by the devil? Well, most church historians have, not churches, or theologians, have looked at Origen's explanation and said, that's probably not biblical, because it implies that Jesus like made a deal with the devil, and the devil like came out of this with money in his pocket, if you will. Right. Like he paid him off, and then the devil went on his way and kept doing devil things. But the way the Bible describes it is that it's not like Jesus paid off the devil, but rather Jesus conquered the devil. Like he's victorious over the devil. He didn't come to pay him off. He came to defeat him forever. Yeah. So a lot of people say that's not a good view. Okay, view number 2, that this ransom was paid by Jesus to God the Father. And just a few verses that might support this. Romans 6:23 says the wages of sin is death. Romans 3:25 and 26 implies that God's justice demands a payment. Then we talk about the wrath of God, right? Like, so 1 John 2:2, Jesus is the propitiation, the propitiating sacrifice for our sins, and not ours alone, but the sins of the whole world. Propitiation has to do with wrath. It's not just that there's a price that has to be paid. It's that there is righteous anger that needs to be satisfied, right? God has been dishonored and it needs to be satisfied. You can see an example of that in Isaiah 53 as well. And so this view is considered stronger. It's held by a lot of people, that Jesus paid the Father, basically paid the ransom to the Father. And you could see this like a little bit, even in the passage we looked at, like Jesus, the cup of suffering refers to the cup of God's judgment or God's wrath. This is why we see it like in the book of Revelation, right? The cups of God's wrath being poured out. Well, the cup of God's wrath that he forces enemies to drink, and it's his judgment upon them, Jesus drinks that cup in our place.
He talks about that in the garden. If this
totally.
cup passed,
Yeah, and he mentions it in chapter 20 because, he says to James and John, are you able to drink the cup that I'm going to drink? So it's a stronger argument, but it's still, there are some problems with it. Like the stronger argument still has this problem, is it almost seems to make it out like the Father really wants to pour out his wrath on us, but the Son intervenes, steps in the way of the Father, right? And pushes us out of the way and takes the hit himself. The problem with that is that it seems to kind of like pit the two against each other. Right. Like the Father is this like wrathful, vengeful one who wants to do that, and Jesus is wanting to save us. But if you look at the scriptures, like especially the Gospel of John, it's very clear. The Father sent the Son on this mission. God, and usually as Jesus is talking about God, it's like he's talking about the Father. The Father so loved the world that he sent the Son, right? Like this wasn't just Jesus's plan to thwart God's plan to bring judgment. This is the Father's plan to bring his people into salvation.
In conjunction with the Son.
Right. So they're unified in this plan. Like Jesus says, I and the Father are one in our mission, in our desires, in our identity. Like we are one. We're completely aligned. And so, somebody might say, well, those aren't mutually exclusive ideas. And I agree. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but it does seem to pit them against each other.
Good cop, bad cop kind of thing. Yeah. Or like the wrathful God of the Old Testament versus the love everyone, kumbaya God of the New Testament kind of feeling.
Exactly. So I think it's a bit unwise for us to try and pit them against each other. And look, I think it's possible to hold that view that the ransom was paid to the Father without pitting them against each other, right? So, I think that's possible. But I would say that the third view, because I mentioned there's like two views. So Origen's view that Jesus paid the price to the devil, that's probably to be rejected. The second view that Jesus paid the ransom to the Father probably is a pretty good view with that one caveat. Right. But then the third view is to say this is a metaphor. And the point of the metaphor is not to get too granular with it. Like if you get too granular, you might actually end up, outside of what Jesus' point is.
Right.
Jesus' point isn't to tell us, well, who did he pay it to, all that stuff, but it's just to say a ransom is a price that you cannot pay for yourself in order to purchase your freedom, and Jesus has purchased your freedom from death and from wrath. He's purchased it for you by paying the price of his blood and by drinking the cup in your place. And that's really the point. In other words, don't miss the point because you're asking a question which the metaphor wasn't designed to answer. Yeah. So I would say I probably hold that view most, but I would say that view of Jesus paying the ransom to the Father is probably accurate with that caveat that we can't pit the Father and Son against each other.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think there's a lot of nuance to everything, and there's a lot of both and.
Oh, yeah.
If you were to look at all of these different things, you can probably even build a bigger argument for all those things together. But yeah, no, definitely we want to get carried away with the ransom metaphor and start to, because we sometimes see that in light of the world that we live in light of the definition that we've now given the word, and just kind of let Scripture define what that means.
Yeah, and you're right about the both and thing. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing where it's like, well, yes, this and this, right? And so we were just talking before we got on, propitiation, which is appeasing the wrath, and the other view is expiation, which is clearing away
or
the
cleansing
guilt.
up,
Yeah, and both of those are true.
Yeah.
You see a lot more of the expiation in the Old Testament, but clearly propitiation is part of this. You do see that in the Old Testament too. I mean, so it's both and. So who did Jesus pay it to? Yeah, he paid it to set us free from the wrath of God, right? He took the judgment in our place. He paid the price. All of these things are true.
All these things are true, yeah. Just on a personal note, this concept is kind of the root of one of the songs we sang Sunday morning, the very first one, Free to Surrender, the idea of that God has died or ransomed our freedom in order, for us to surrender to him. That whole concept of what you just talked about earlier, the idea that we can then give ourselves over, to the Lord as a bond servant, in the words of, what was his name, Bob Dylan, we all got to serve somebody, right? We all serve somebody. I mean, that's the great illusion of society today, that you can be your own boss. And I think you talked about that on Sunday. People want to be your own boss. Well, that is a concept that is, flawed in many ways. We are serving something in the world, and we want to serve a God who loves us and committed, and in Christ committed to dying for us in the state that we're in our sin. And so being free to surrender because we had a debt that we could not pay. And then Romans 12, of course, we now present ourselves a sacrifice, holy and acceptable to him through the righteousness of Christ. So yeah, that's great stuff to look at. And yeah, great deep way to look at that word ransom, and yeah, you let us know what you think. I know this is a debate. I know I came across it a lot when I was in school, this idea of wrath and who's the wrath upon, and that's a debate within the music circles as well. Should we even talk about that? It's a famous modern hymn, Christ Alone, and there was this church denomination wouldn't include that in there because they said in the second verse it says the wrath of God was satisfied. And, and there's another one we sing. It says, my sin held him on the cross. And some people argue, no, it was the love of God that held him on the cross. Kind of both and. So this is not necessarily like an out there debate. This is a debate that I think it's good that you come to a conclusion about it. You study it, you think it through, read the verses, take a deep dive into it and find out where you land on it. And I think it's a worthwhile debate because what it does reveal is the fact that we indeed had a debt we could not pay, and that I think is the final, when you come down to it, is that, why I would kind of land on the metaphor as well, is that we had a debt that could not be paid, but it was paid we had no way to God, right? We had to come to God through Jesus Christ. And so exciting stuff. So you got, if you have some thoughts on that, let us know what you think. And we're going to be back. We'll continue through Matthew. What are we looking at next week?
We're looking at the triumphal entry.
Oh, yeah.
And And it's really interesting that it's called the triumphal entry, and I can't wait to tell you why.
All right.
That word triumph is a Roman word. You've probably heard of triumphal arcs and things like that, arches in Europe. Well, the triumph was a specific kind of parade. And so to call Jesus's entry into Jerusalem a triumph, the Romans would have looked at it and they would have said, what are you talking about? There's a guy not even on like a regular donkey. He's on like a baby donkey.
Yeah.
Like it's like a large dog
A foal.
almost. Yeah. And I mean, it's really, there's so much in there that is more than just like Jesus cruising into Jerusalem. There's a lot in there, and it'll tie into one of my favorite verses in Colossians chapter 1.
Oh, outstanding.
About triumph.
Well, there you go. We want to see you on Sunday morning. If you're here in Longmont, we'd love to see you. Come here. Our services are 9:15 and 11. We'd love to have you here, but you can also catch us online. So we'll see you next week. God bless.